Hello, friends. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our digital space where we explore the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. We've been gone for a little while. It's been a little bit of a hiatus for us, but we're back now here in 2024, getting started with a bang. I'm joined today by a good friend, Mr. Joseph Grossheim, and also Dr. Richard Kelly. We're going to talk about important intellectual, philosophical, political developments of the last year in 2023. I think a couple things happened. Isn't that right, gentlemen?
Yeah, a few.
A few. I mean, I think even at the very end there, like we got like a Christmas surprise, like sort of midway through December, right as we're all just sort of getting ready to celebrate the holiday. But it's been an eventful. Isn't it like some sort of ancient curse to wish someone that they live in eventful times?
Interesting times.
Interesting
Yeah,
times.
right.
That's right. Yeah. So we must be highly cursed, unfortunately, live in interesting times. Really, from it just seems like one thing after another. I would say the acceleration of events and intensity, to me, kind of traces back to the election of was it Donald Trump in 2016. Which just like made everything that was already sort of a conflict like triply intense or something, just everything got ratcheted up for sure. But I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, every year has its important changes, developments. I do think in modernity, because of the kind of availability of communication, availability of information, maybe there's more changes, or we're just maybe more aware of deep and significant changes happening. But I also think it kind of accelerates it. I do think
I think for sure.
the
For sure,
institution.
there's an acceleration because
Yeah,
there's a technological capacity for it
that's right. That's right.
that
Yeah,
before
yeah,
there
yeah.
just wasn't.
So whereas it took a long time maybe for things to develop in the past, now they can. You can even have sort of like almost like flash riots and mobs, right?
Mhm.
Organized. I know that in some northern cities there's even a phenomena of teenagers getting together and organizing um, you know I guess almost like raids on stores in certain areas. Like they'll get on Snapchat and some other social communication channels and just organize like these like events where they'll just go rush a bunch of stores and just grab stuff out of the stores.
So looting.
And run.
Okay.
Yeah, looting basically. Yeah. And because there's so many of them, there's really nothing you can do about it, right? Or very little. I mean, what's a store clerk going to do? Like get in a fight with 30 teenagers? No, right? I mean, take it. Like
Yeah.
So
Spontaneous
anyways,
organized crime, a whole new category.
Yeah. That's very good. Yeah, well put. So today we want to kind of go over some of those things, look at some of the major changes in culture, politics, theology that we've seen. Certainly, I think we could say that one trend that's carried over really, it's funny. It just kind of got kicked off. Oh, Joe, you might be better at remembering this, but there was this famous athlete connected to the Kardashians who became.
Why would I remember this?
I don't know. Well, because you're younger.
I don't follow the Kardashians.
But there was a Jenner. What was his name?
Oh no, yeah, Caitlyn Jenner. Is that?
Yeah. When Caitlyn Jenner happened, like it was interesting. Like the transsexual thing almost had like an official rollout. Like. When that happened, when Jenner went through this very public sex change, right? It was just like all of a sudden transsexuality became a big deal, right? And certainly that's carried through into this year to some this past year to some degree, and then issues connected to it. Certainly issues connected to say marriage, declining birth rates. All those sorts of things. Also last year, 2022, not the year before last, we had the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We've seen a lot of the blowback from there. So there's a lot of area there that, where connects sort of sexual morality, culture of life, those sorts of issues that we've seen bubble up in the last year. I've been interested to see a couple things, and Joe, I'll kind of get your reaction to this, but in particular, right, that there has been a real reassertion of the support for abortion by large segments of the American population, right? That is like a really doubling down. Like once Roe v. Wade was kind of surprisingly overturned, perhaps there was like, no, like this is a fundamental right, and we're not going. I mean, you hear that language used about abortion, that is a fundamental right, and that, you know, there's been some electoral victories on that side, right? In connection to abortion in particular. He's also seen sort of, I think, interestingly, along with that, a strong assertion of the positive values of being a dink, right? Or being involved in dink culture, which is an acronym, right, for dual income, no kids, right? That is that it's better to have a childless life, right? And you'll see, you know, young people sort of celebrate, you know, people in their 20s celebrating this sort of thing, right? Those sorts of things to me seem, you know, somewhat connected. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Well, this is my first thought was that back to like our interesting times. I do think that the 2016 election, I don't think that it introduced a lot of new questions, but I think that for better or for worse, I mean, it probably could have it could have been done better for sure. But what Trump did for us was he made it okay to talk about these things. And so the internet, I think, has been a big facilitator for these discussions. And that's certainly true. But I think there's a lot of courage that the right has found since then, because they've got somebody who's willing to say things, it certainly in ways that I think that most of us wouldn't want to say it. But that gives us the sort of space we need to have these conversations more publicly. Sure. And so that leads us to be able to do things like overturn Roe v. Wade and be proud about it and not apologetic about it. So that's really good. I think the reaction is predictable, of course, that they would want to reinforce their arguments in favor of abortion. They need to, because for the first time in a long time, we're winning on the front, and it feels good, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But the driving issue behind people that are interested in abortion rights, so-called, and I think dink culture that you mentioned, is old, right? It goes back to the separation of the human good from any sense of real responsibility, right? And our sexual nature, JP2 points this out, right? That our sexual nature is rooted in responsibility. And then you even have popular folks today like Jordan Peterson really trying to push the value of a life that has some responsibility in it, right? But they're pushing back against that, and it's from one of the, you know, the oldest ethical problem in the book, which is to seek simple gratification over and against that long, hard, arduous good that the human good really consists in.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's ever old, ever new, I think.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about some of the videos you can find on YouTube, like if you want to find this kind of stuff, it's very easy. I just go on, you know, YouTube and say "life without kids," you know, just put that in, or "life with no kids," right? And it'll bring up all of this sort of very pro no kids, right? And the themes always are look at the vacation I got to go on.
Yeah.
Look at
the income, the freedom.
Yeah, look at the adventure, the biking adventure I went on. Look at the backpacking adventure I went on. Look at all these fun things and creative things I'm able to do because I don't have kids, right?
And, you know, the restaurants you could eat at because your kids won't complain.
That's right. That's right.
And that is especially exacerbated by the internet and social media, right? Where to be on social media is to share your adventures. That's what most people understand, right?
Right.
And as a young person who, you know, is at least familiar with like online dating culture and stuff, that your profile needs to have that sort of thing in there. You to be a
if there's
young,
on a
marketable bachelor. What's that?
Right?
Sorry.
You're not standing on a mountain summit.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, that needs to be somewhere preeminent. You know, you got to be a mountaineer and a kayaker. Yeah, I mean, being a world traveler is really valuable right now. I don't know why that is a thing.
I heard somebody say that experiences have replaced the Corvette.
Yeah, and I understand that
Mm.
experiences over things.
Sure.
That's good,
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, I could get that too. I think, in fact, that's a legitimate pushback, I would say, against materialist culture, right?
Right.
Um,
Unless
but
the vacation is it's I think you could, yes it is, and though it could also be the case that the vacation just becomes another commodity.
Yep.
right.
Yeah, and that the social
Right.
media thing does that, right? Because
Right.
you're on the vacation, but you're looking at it through the lens of the camera on your phone,
Right.
rather than actually having the experience.
Right.
Yeah, the plan is to go there and take the pictures. You plan out what you're going to wear on the mountain.
Like, gotta post it on Instagram or something.
Yeah, right.
Do you see when we think about these things, to my mind, I think there is some connection with dual income, no kids, abortion culture, um, and then also, sort of kind of irregular forms of sexuality. What ties them all together to me, right, is a departure from what I would consider sort of a natural ordering towards sexuality, in which the view very much is the reproduction of children, right? That is that reproduction of the species, right? That is that we want to have children. We come together to have children. We want to develop the virtues that are apt for having children and for cooperating with a spouse over a long period of time to have a household, right? Those are we think about traditional human life, right? And even sort of dramatic stories about human life. Dramatic stories about human life very often revolve around falling away from that order or trying to save that order or trying to restore that order, right? That order is just kind of what human life is, right? For a great deal of it, which is just the routines of the cycle of reproduction, production, industry, economy. All of that is tied into which you could call something like natalism, right? That is an affirmative view of. It sounds so stale. Let's put it this way, but I like to put it this way: the preservation of the species, right? Like it literally is the preservation of the species, right?
Yeah.
That we're talking about, as well as at a more personal level. I know this sounds weird, but it's something I didn't sort of believe when I was younger, and I would read Aristotle on this, but the replication of oneself in one's children, right? Are the replications of one's ancestors in their children. Like I see a lot of my grandparents in my children, and there's a sense in which, not to be a pagan about it, but there's a sense in which, my family continues in my offspring, right? And I think that's a very natural way that most people have thought about their ancestors and their children, right? That seems very absent to our own consideration of these matters. That there's actually sort of like a duty, and maybe not even just a duty, an honor, a pleasure to continue one's family, right? I want to do this because I love my family.
What strikes me about that is that back to the experiences over things, right? There's an experience that you're having raising your children, right? That I think is really valuable and isn't really, I guess, understood or perhaps marketed. It's certainly not marketed at all, right?
Sure.
I think that the driving force against antinatalism is this sort of life without responsibility, the acquisition of simple pleasures, right? It's a very baseline and almost animalistic way of being human.
Right.
But even this thing that you're talking about, which is also very animalistic, right? Reproduction, right? We have that in common with the animals, but nonetheless, the experience that you're describing is not just the fact that one has self-replicated.
Right. Sure.
But I've got a human being here from my lineage, and just to add to it, right, one that is not just produced and left alone that you just kind of watch, right, from the outside, but that you can direct and you can be witness to and delight in their accomplishments. Like in the way the only analogy I have right now is as a teacher over students, right? But when you can witness somebody achieve something, that's, I think, really special. And
Mm.
when parents get together, or when I'm together with parents who have kids, they love to talk about what their kids have done. It brings them so much joy.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, it's unfortunate that a dink would
Mhm.
miss that, right? What they can share is what their husband or their wife,
Yeah.
or what they've accomplished, but that's just another adult, right? I think it's
Yes.
very different when it's a child that's growing into this, especially under your care.
Yeah, yeah, that's part of you and not part of you,
Yeah.
right? It's like there's it is in a certain sense an extension of you, but it's more than an extension of you. And I think like terms like heritage and legacy matter a lot there, right? When you think of I think of myself as being blessed to be part of my family, and there's a legacy that I want to hand on to my kids that I want to see them hand on, right? Um, but I think yeah, a lot of that's maybe missing from the way we talk about family and children.
Yeah. And it's difficult, I think, because the more we shift towards dink culture,
Hmm.
I think it just becomes harder to live the sort of life that has, say, a lot of children, right? I
Mm.
think, I don't know the economic impacts of this, but I've mentioned this before. I think that as the market shifts towards the balance of this dual income, no kids family, I guess if I can
Hmm.
call them a family, right? Um, I think it becomes harder to compete with that if you're a cop trying to raise five
Sure.
kids at home.
Right. Right.
Your life on the outside does not look like you're having the good sort of experiences that people
Uh-huh.
have, even though
Yeah.
you are, right? You get to witness your son drive a screw for the first time,
Sure. Yeah. Oh, that's
but that doesn't look as flashy as getting your 16-year-old like a brand new car, or going to
uh-huh.
Paris or something like that.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we've been seeing the push in the direction of the dink economy has actually been happening for a long time,
Sure.
right? I mean, you go back to the expectation starting in the 1980s that
Hmm.
women would be in the workplace just as much as men, right?
Hmm.
As opposed to the way it once was, right? Where if women were in the workplace at all, um, it was um, it was typically transient, right? Until they got married, or it was
Right.
as part of an immediate family business.
Hmm.
That was sort of and it wasn't that women didn't like just have jobs. That's not the case, but it wasn't that wasn't what people aspired to, right? They wanted to
Yeah.
be
Sure.
you wanted to like not have to do that.
Mm.
But then starting in the really in the 80s, this push for this expectation that women, of course, will have careers, right? Just like men.
Mm.
That created a situation in which it was no longer really possible for most people to get by as middle class
Sure.
citizens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
On a single income.
Yeah. There's some really good examples about this. I'll have to dig it out and maybe put it in the show notes, but there was a British TV sort of comedy from that I think what was supposed to have taken place, like say in the 1940s, 1950s, which featured a father of a family who was a bus driver in England. And as a bus driver in England at that time in the 1950s, he could afford a 3-bedroom house and for his wife to not work full time. I think she had some sort of side work she did, but her primary work was domestic. And he had several kids, all on that mostly on that one income. And they actually have gone to the place where this was studied or where it was filmed. I'm sorry, the original sitcom. It lasted for several seasons, but the house that was featured there couldn't possibly be afforded now by a bus driver. They said it takes like 5 bus drivers to afford it now, right? Where in the 1950s it was actually realistic. The wage was high enough. It was actually realistic, or the housing was affordable enough, however you want to cut it, that a bus driver could on one income purchase a home. If you know anybody that lives in England or have ever been to England, actually home ownership is very rare.
Yeah.
in England.
And well, increasingly in the United States too, we now have this problem where like Gen Zers, right? And late millennials now find themselves in a position where they really can't imagine ever being able to afford to buy a home. Right. So their sights are now set on this is in the United States. Their sights are now set on renting, right? And the dink advantage, right, is that they can go for these luxury rentals that they offer. But still, home ownership, nah.
Yeah, dicks are less likely to want a yard, right?
What's that?
They're less likely to want a yard.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And in all the developments that are going up, there's not
That's
much.
what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Like
really
the new developments are going to respond to what the market wants, right? And if the market wants more luxurious apartments or they don't want yards, then the development will not have yards, or it will be more luxurious. And then you've got your cop with 5 kids who can't find something that's
and the developers are building
something.
they're building developments for rentals, not for not for sale.
Yeah.
So
so tell me what you think about this. You know, if we see sort of like that kind of departure from what we might consider a natural natal order, and if you think about economy, right, and economics and society and culture in general, right, if you think that the family, the natural family, right, is the basic unit, right, that things should be organized in such a way to make that possible, right, and to at least make it, at least to sort of facilitate the formation of family, right?
Yes, distributism.
Yeah, or something like it, right? Yeah. We could get maybe our friend Phil on and debate those points, but you know, I think a similar sort of line of worry could, or you know, concern could be connected to, you know, sort of the developments we've seen recently in the tech field, right? Where, you know, we see you know, sort of the development of AI, the development of sort of things related to AI. We see both the ubiquity of social media as well as sort of the censorship of social media, which is kind of in touch with each other. I wonder sometimes, and I think that I think sometimes that there are maybe aspects of the tech world that sort of push against a more natural order for human beings, right? That kind of sort of separates us to some degree from the natural order of things and just even sort of human nature, right? So, you know, one thing that was interesting, right, during COVID is we discovered, I think a lot of people discovered that internet connections are not sufficient, right? That is, there was all of a sudden a big push towards let's do church by internet, let's do friendship by internet, let's do all these things by internet, education overwhelmingly by internet, etc. And people found that, you know, that's okay, but it's not actually enough, right? Like I thought that was a moment where there was some reassertion, right? You know, I mean, pretty well recognized now by most educational experts, right? That this was bad for kids, right?
Yeah,
that it did not work well for their educational outcomes. Do you guys see anything connected there in terms of, you know, obviously we've talked some. There's been a longer conversation about transhumanism, right? That is using technological devices and computers to replace parts of human nature that are deficient or weaker or anything along those lines. Anything in the last year that maybe makes you think about that?
I think that
yeah, go ahead.
I think that we have well, let's winding things back to that 2016 event, right? The Black Swan event of the Trump election. One of the things that I remember talking about then was that there was this expectation on the part of people like you and me that we would see, as a consequence of that phenomenon, a kind of falling out of allegiances, right? Basically, a realignment, right, of
Sure.
people's people kind of choosing sides, right? We kind of expected, I think, at the time that traditional categories would begin to deconstruct and people would sort of take, sides in another way. And in fact, that is what happened to a great extent. But I think that bifurcation in society that we began to see then, where it wasn't as if 2016 was the moment at which it happened, but because I remember commenting on this phenomenon before that, several years before that. But what I saw was the middle, right, which used to be this vast swath of society, with only a few people on either fringe, right? The middle started to drop out. It became just shrinking down until really the two sides, I don't really want to call them left and right for the sake of this discussion, but whatever those two sides are culturally, right? They became, it seemed as if you were on one or the other side, right? This sort of tribalization of society. And I think that we continue to see that. We saw that continue to happen throughout 2023. And one of the interesting things that touches on the discussion we've been having so far, really, is that on the one hand, right, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, which was considered a huge triumph for people like you and me, we also saw a pushback against it.
Sure.
With some predictable results. We also see, even though you've got gender theory going strong in certain circles, you've also got, I think, a pushback against that as well. And similarly with, the related issue of the dink culture, feminism, and so forth, you've got pushback against that as well. So you're starting to see a few things happen in society, and you began to see this really over the last year. There was a trad wife social phenomenon on TikTok that I heard of. And what that's pointing to is, I think, this other thing. I heard it put like this. I think it was called soft girl or something, right? The rise of the soft girl. Basically, the soft girl is the non-feminist. The soft girl is the woman who wants to be, she wants to live a much more traditionally feminine life that doesn't involve having a career outside the home, right? It involves being married and having children. It's this sort of trad wife thing.
Sure.
There are now people coming out and just sort of saying that.
That's
in
true.
contrast to 20 years ago, when I first started teaching in higher ed. And I remember this young woman came to my office. She was one of my students. She was getting ready to graduate, and she was obviously distraught. She had tears in her eyes and everything. And I asked her what the problem was. And basically the problem was that everyone, her parents, her friends, everyone around her, right, was just pushing her to have a career, to go to graduate school, become a physician assistant, whatever it was. And that's not what she wanted to do. She wanted to get married and have kids and raise them at home. And no one was telling her that was okay. So that was 20 years ago. But now people are coming out and saying, no, you know what? That is what I want.
There is more pushback. I agree. I think that there are places you can find it where you can find sort of like, again, it's interesting though, that to me, it's interesting. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, you're connecting it to having children, right? And there is just something about a lot of these issues. Like the more I think about the left, I'm gonna go ahead and use left and right. The more I think about the left, the more I think they're just against kids. I know that's a weird thing to say because very often they seem to be the most for the children, right?
Yeah.
But lots they're against, they're for, I guess they're for in some abstract way kids, but just not them having them, right? Or they don't want to support the structures by which people make choices like this, because this is it's this kind of person, right, that brings out, right, the best situation, right, for having children. I mean, we've even seen sociological data on this over and over again. The traditional family is the best for children, right? We never mention that, and we never show it in our media, right? We always show the father, strong fathers is bad, all that kind of thing, right? But actually, we know the sociological data is different. We just had a new big study out that I think Pew was even involved in, where it talked about the mental health of conservative family, the children of conservative families is significantly higher than that of progressive and liberal families. You won't hear that anywhere, right? But it did come out. I mean, it was in the news. So there is sort of this pushback, and there are places. One thing you talked about, the trad wife thing, Rich. There's a YouTube show I watch called Subversive on a pretty regular basis. It's a lady named Alex Kashuta, and she was very much in the higher echelon, aspiration, high career, high tech in that world, right? And her story is really interesting because she's like, I did this and I was doing it. I was the successful one and I hated it, right? And she's like, she was even like from an Eastern European country, had gone to England to do it, and was like part of the jet set in London and just hated it, and said like, this can't be it, right? And started her own journey that has involved some, contact with Christianity, but not just Christianity, but other just sort of, I would call traditional human life, right? Kind of things. And that's why her podcast is called Subversive, because being traditional, like doing the kinds of things, pursuing the kinds of goals that humans have traditionally pursued, right?
Yeah, right.
To give
neo-traditionalism is a term I've heard,
right? is just sort of subversive, right? Kind of like this choice. I was thinking with tech, right, that one of the areas I'm concerned with tech, I mean, we already know along these lines, right? In this last year, we already know, right, all the devastating effects of pornography, right? And the degree to which the internet has made that even way worse, right, than it ever was beforehand. I mean, I think beforehand pornography was a problem, but I mean, it was like a magazine, and it was like had these weird covers on it back behind the shelf at the convenience store. You had
to go out of your way to buy.
You had to ask for
it,
right? Or it's in this really shady part of town, right? That kind of thing. Well, the internet just changed that overnight. Right. It just, it's been terrible for our souls. I mean, I think going along those lines, something that's going to be as bad as AI generated pornography, right? And I mean, I get on my Facebook feeds little advertisements on the side that say, chat with an AI generated girl now, right? And I'm just like, what is that? Like, I mean, that's weird. Like, first, why would I want to chat with somebody? But anyways, like, we know that that's where that's going, right? Is in that direction. And one of the really problematic aspects of that is that it's very much consumer catered or consumer generated and tailored, right, to the consumer of it, which makes it all the more addictive and problematic.
I wrote about this issue, not the AI part, but the problem of like masturbation and pornography from a moral, like, personalist perspective. I wrote about this some time back for a conference paper, which one day I'll revise and publish. But basically, the way I described it was that you have this urge that of its very nature draws the person to leave the mereness of himself behind and reach out to the other.
Sure.
But it gets truncated and turned back in upon itself, right? So that instead of seeking myself in the other, I seek the other in myself. And that's never satisfying in the long run, right? Because the very reason for which that urge is experienced is never brought to fruition. Right. So, and this is it's a different argument, I guess, from a traditional natural law argument, but I don't think it's incompatible with a natural law argument.
No, I've used that argument dialectically in class to
Uh-huh.
suggest to students that like if this was actually off the table, if masturbation pornography was actually off the table, and the limits of your hope for any sort of interaction to fulfill that drive required you to better yourself so that you would be a desirable partner for somebody else,
Right.
then that's good for you, right?
Yeah.
You have to do that so that somebody else will say yes to you, and then you can be together, right?
That's
But
right. And
yeah,
on this model, you don't have to, right?
right.
You just remain merely yourself. And worse, right? Worse, because you even begin to deconstruct yourself. You begin to reduce yourself to just the gratification of that desire.
Yeah.
And so when you now introduce AI generated pornography and AI chat girlfriends or something, which are totally constructed on the basis of your own inner fantasies, right?
Right.
It's all you all the time.
Right.
I mean,
It's good. Yeah, it affirms you exactly as you are, no matter how bad and perverse you get, right? I think it's even a little worse now that this AI chat option is there because they can read words generated for themselves that affirm who they are and what they're doing.
yeah.
Right. It's worse than just the imagination or the images.
Yeah. It's tailor made for enslavement, right?
Yeah.
A kind of enslavement maybe that feels good for a while, right? But is enslaving. Right?
What's interesting about there being a marketplace for an AI chat girlfriend is that
how weird. But
it's weird, but okay, what it's showing me is that people are actually not satisfied with pornography, right? Because there's something that's missing there, and they're
the relationship
that, right? There's some sort of they want an interpersonal connection, right? Even as all of our current relationships are commodified, right? They want something that's not commodified, or they don't want to be treated as a commodity, right? So there's this market for that's suggesting that people want the real thing, but unfortunately, what has been supplied to them now is yet something else artificial that's not going to challenge them to become better, but just affirm them as they descend lower and lower.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And they can't get it from a real human being.
Right.
It's not just because he's a loser.
Yeah.
Right. It's that the whole of social interaction is now just not productive of such relations.
Yeah, it's funny. So there's been a picture going around, and I think this was maybe the UK Mail originally put this out. It's MAIL, which is a newspaper, but it ran initially as a story of here are I think I'm quoting 5 sexy, sassy, and solvent ladies who can't find men who are good enough for them, right? And it's all these ladies in their late 40s and 50s who never got married earlier, right? And they're sassy, whatever that means, I don't know. But and solvent means they're well-to-do, right? And apparently sexy, and they're like, why can't they find adequate husbands, right? So people have been taking a picture of this and sending it around, right? Giving different answers that are sarcastic, but also partly true, right? About probably they can't, because most of why can't they find good guys? Because most of the good guys don't want whatever sassy is supposed to mean, right? Or you could add other things in, right? And there is this dialectic right now on the internet, on YouTube, right, where there is a really interesting, and I would say sometimes funny, critique of contemporary women, not necessarily from a Christian perspective, but just sort of a natural, rational perspective that hey, there's a reason we're not interested in dating and marriage anymore, because you guys aren't really meritable, right? And that actually ends up being a bad deal for a lot of men, right? Especially the way divorce laws are set up, right? So it's better to just not get involved in
that. So that's a terrible outcome
that redounds back into this bad situation where, okay, well, I actually do want a girlfriend, but I don't think any of the girls are decent. And so like I ended up in this bad situation of, well, there's this chat GP thing or whatever.
Yeah. So so people are going on like trips overseas to look for wives, right, from Western countries because they don't feel
I
they
mean,
can
men
find
from
them.
Western countries are going to overseas, right?
People
To
from
find
Western
women.
countries are going
Yeah, right,
overseas
yeah,
in
right.
search of brides
Uh,
from non-Western countries.
non-Western, yeah.
So, but this goes to that pushback thing, right? So these are
Sure.
what we see are terrible outcomes
Right.
in the medium term, but but in the end, right, what you have is you have maybe a recovery of more traditional ideas, right?
Mhm.
That there's some possible future for them
Sure.
because people have had enough.
Right.
And you see this in a lot of different places. It's in the dating marketplace, right? It's in economics, it's in politics, it's in academia, gender theory. Seems to cover like lots of different aspects of society, religion,
Right.
um, right? A kind of neo-traditionalism that's asserting itself.
Yeah. I think that's true. I wish it was more, but yeah, that is there, and I think that is a feature. Like when I talk to students, when I engage, in internet research, that you do find, and that is encouraging.
Mhm.
You got to think that
Sure.
it's sorry.
Go ahead. No.
You got to think that at some point, I think with the experience people have with pornography and being the way that our pornographic society treats people, that eventually you will get to a point where society is at rock bottom and just realizes this isn't good. We need to work back somewhere. I thought it was when I first heard somebody say that women can have a woman can have a penis, right?
Right.
But that was not it. We still kept going.
Yeah, where is the bottom?
Yeah,
What you're
when
looking for is
you're-
that moment of lucidity, right?
Yeah, right. Where
you
it's
say,
just
hey.
clearly so absurd what's going on around me that
So I want to go ahead then and segue a little bit then to talking about politics explicitly, because I think this is tied into this question of lucidity, Joe. So I have been engaged in political philosophy and thought for a long time, right? That's kind of what got me interested in philosophy, that and theological questions, right? Were the two kind of things that originally kind of got me interested, right? There were a lot of other things I was interested in philosophy, but political philosophy was always one of the main things, right? And, over that time, I've had a lot of time to sort of like think differently, right? Kind of go in different directions at different times. I wrote my dissertation on Thomas Aquinas and the common good. There have been times, and I've talked about this, where I've tried to sort of think, well, what's the best way to translate Thomistic ideas about the common good into our contemporary politics, right? And in sort of hopefully, well-meaning Aristotelian ways of trying to like look at, let's say, American ideas and understand them as best I could in a way that is Aristotelian and Thomist. Do you follow me? Right. But and so try to, kind of, I would say, as a matter of historical reality, that the backdrop theory involved in American polity, right, has been liberalism. I qualify that strongly with the idea that also there was a lot going on in our culture and historical background that was not just liberalism, right? So it included, a very strong emphasis in Protestant Christianity, connections to British customs, all that kind of thing, right? So it wasn't sort of a liberalism in the abstract, right? Mm-hmm. And various proponents of liberalism have conceded at various times that liberalism only works when there are strong non-liberal components supporting it, right? So strong culture, strong family, strong, that kind of thing, right? So that if you have enough things built in, right, then you can have a kind of liberalism, right? That is where you try to let people be as free as possible to make individual choices, right?
It's because you can rely on the customs that are reinforcing that, correct?
That's right. Right. Yeah, that's right. I think there was a point at which we no longer said that, right? But we benefited from it,
Mhm.
right? We did have a set of assumptions, and those assumptions were Christian and European primarily.
Yeah. So when you become
And
hostile to that, it changes everything.
that's right. Yeah. Now, over a series of decades, when you deconstruct a European Christian set of cultural assumptions, and all you're left with is liberalism, then I think you are actually in bad shape, right? And I kind of think that's where we are politically. That is, even to use the phrase European is kind of sketchy, right? I'm using it advisedly. That to say that the historical background of America is European, right? And you wouldn't have gotten a place like America from Imperial China, right? You got a place like America from Europe, and especially from the British part of Europe, right? And that Christianity was a big part of that, right? Well, we've deconstructed that over 20, 30, 40 years now to where Christianity is not really a public, at least not the public force it once was. And that basically Europeans are evil, right? They're all colonializing, imperialist, racist, homophobes, and sexist, right? Basically, right? So that, if you're a good leftist, you should hate most of your European ancestors if you have European ancestors, right? Correct? I mean, that's true. I mean, that's the truth, right? Because the truth is, I mean, the left is correct about this. Most Europeans were racist in some way, right? I would say in a way that most civilizations and most cultures have been, right?
Yeah,
as in
most of them
preferring their own, right?
Uh-huh.
And thinking that their own were a little bit better, right?
Yeah.
Now you could take that to extremes or whatever, but I think that's just true, right? And so once you get into your mind that that's the worst thing, then you're going to say, well, my ancestors suck. I hate them, right? They're all racist.
Yep.
So anyways, I think once we've deconstructed all of that to where there's no ethos or ethnos, right, that ties us together, all we're left with is liberalism. And I just don't think it's sufficient to help us get to that point of lucidity, Joe.
Well, I think that's certainly true. The question, though, that seems important here is the same sort of question I have for folks that just point to Vatican II as like a source of many problems.
Sure.
I always say that, well, Vatican II was conducted, in the time of Vatican I, and Vatican I was its own time, and as the time of the old mass and things like that, right? And so I want to know what, if we once had these customs, we lost these customs at a time when we had these customs, right? And so at one time, these customs were working together and reinforcing what was good in liberalism. And then somehow we lost the customs, even when we had the marriage between these two things that are supposed to work and preserve us from
I have
our present situation.
I have a clear answer to that. The clear answer to that is that the customs aren't enough. You also need power, and that we slowly lost the power. We've lost the power in institutions, and when you lose the power in those institutions, then you lose the customs, right? Once you have the power of replacing personnel, deciding the faculty, deciding all of the bureaucrats in the system, right? Then the custom can be changed, right? And it only takes a cadre. It doesn't take a lot of people. It just takes a cadre of determined people, right?
Yeah.
To grab power, right? And this is kind of along the lines of my criticism of some on the right, is I don't think that, and why I don't think liberalism under the terms in which we had it is recoverable, right? I think that project's over. And the reason that project is over is I don't think we're under the conditions under which we can regenerate those non-liberal factors that would support liberalism, right? We're under a situation in which we're in kind of no man's land, kind of a combat land, kind of a, not apocalyptic, but kind of on the, like from a cultural, spiritual point of view, right? And such that the way to redo that isn't like we're not in a position where we can say, oh, well, we'll get the right politics once we get the right culture. I think what actually has to be the case is the right people need to get the power. And then once they have the power, then they can create the situations in which we have a good culture.
Yeah.
But I think under our current situation, I don't think we can regenerate those non-liberal conditions.
So you're suggesting that the material conditions have changed so much that the right regime is no longer the same old liberal regime?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. I don't think the right regime under our current circumstances is like a lot of liberalism with a lot of non-liberal cultural support. That may have worked, right, and been a wonderful thing, but it's gone. And since it's gone, I think the way to redo it is, you gotta recapture the institutions and the power, right, in order to do that.
Just to clear up my question on the causes here, you said earlier that the customs declined because we lost power, I guess, in government and in probably the universities.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is still, though, all right, those folks that pursued power in the universities and in politics, they were clearly, or at least it seems to me, clearly not influenced by the present custom. And so where did they come from? Do you have a thought about that?
We had talked about that before with our friend Deacon Gorman. Is that right?
Gorman, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that customs are helpful. Nothing is a guarantee. I mean, right?
Sure.
Good laws and good customs are helpful and highly effective in some cases.
Yeah. I don't mean to say that it's a guarantee. I just want to know what was the shot that sunk the ship here.
I think in one thing is what happened to a good question to ask that in America is what happened to mainstream Protestantism, right? Because mainstream Protestantism wasn't always liberal, right, in America, right? That's a good question, but also I think our elites kind of sold us out, right? As in, I always think there are going to be elites in society. I think they being anti-elitist as a per se position is silly, right? You got to have leaders and elitists, right, or elites at some point. I think our group of elites over a period of time kind of sold us out. I mean, I think people like Woodrow Wilson, folks of that nature, adopted socialist or other aligned theories over time. But it doesn't take too many, right, of the elite class to go wrong, right, in order for the institutions to go the other way, especially if they're well placed.
So the suggestion then is that it's the old conflict, the one that goes all the way back to the Roman Republic, which our founding fathers had in mind, and they tried to put bulwarks up against, and it just, like the Roman Republic, it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I mean, hey, it worked for 200 years.
Yeah.
That's cool. Good.
Yeah,
I don't feel like I'm a realist, right? So
we have to move on now.
Yeah, now it worked for that time. The Supreme Court played a big role in all that. Those are certainly elite people, for sure. I think, there's a lot going on there, but I think, the power dynamics are the ones that ultimately flipped it.
Well, one of the interesting
of course, the left understands that, though, right? I mean, the left, I think, more than the right understands their whole language is power dynamics.
Yeah, I kind of agree, and I kind of think that's where we should read Dante, but we should also spend a good bit of time reading Machiavelli. That like the reality is the good prince shouldn't just be a good philosopher, right? The good prince should know the truths of right reason and theology, but he needs to be apt to the ways of power politics, right? Otherwise, he's just going to lose, right? I mean, we want the good guys to win, right? I don't want to lose, right? I mean, if it's as the lead actor says in Man for All Seasons, right? It's like, if God brings us to martyrdom, so be it. But until then, right? Like, it's our business to do the best that we can to win. So, but yeah, you're right. I think, Rich, the left is better at thinking about in terms of power, right? One of the things that they're very good at, a very good example of this is there's something like 2,000 to 3,000 jobs in the federal bureaucracy that the president can just straight appoint without any congressional approval, right? These are jobs of all different kinds of levels, like sub deputy to the blah blah blah, right? Right, it's part of the federal bureaucracy, right? Well, President Obama, when he came in, this is the way the left is very good at this. They filled every single one of those positions, right? And they filled them with committed left loyalists, right? Trump comes in, he can fire all those people if he wants, right? Right? He doesn't. He hardly fires any of them, and doesn't even replace a lot of the positions that are empty. Right now, I think that's because he didn't know. Like Chris Christie was his transition guy. That's really hilarious thinking of that now, right? Right. But Chris Christie was his replacement guy, and Chris Christie didn't think Trump was going to win. Trump probably didn't think he was going to win, right? There were a couple of people who thought he was going to win, but it was pretty small. But like he just didn't do what you needed to do is fill that bureaucracy with hard right loyalists, right? That's the way you wield power effectively.
Yeah, and up until that point, like every president understood that, it seemed, coming in. Trump is
the left is better than the right, but yeah. Yeah.
Well,
so my I thought about that makes me think in terms of our philosophical rhetoric, right? Is that I'll put this down to free speech as it could get concrete, right? We for a while complained on the right about cancel culture and complained on the right about lack of free speech on universities and social media, things of that nature, right? I think those arguments are just okay-ish, but where we, a good example of the right it being effective was in the resignation of the two college presidents recently. That was right-wing cancel culture, and it worked. That's and there's all sorts of leftists out there who are in universities who are saying, "Gosh, man, you got to be careful now," right? Now that's probably an exaggeration, a little bit of hand wringing, but I think the days of trying to defend our positions with free speech and that sort of thing, probably we're better off imitating the left and saying, you know what, we'll cancel you, right? That's our response. I mean, like that view with respect to speech, right? I mean, error has no right, right?
So you're kind of describing from at least a sociological point of view, a kind of an existential crisis.
Yeah.
Basically, you have incommensurable values. There's no,
and a breakdown of communication, right? If we're trying to wield power and cancel culture, we're not using the arts of persuasion anymore.
Well, I think what
maybe I misunderstand
is talking about, though, with the using power, using cancel culture, which the left had been happy to do for quite a while, right?
Sure.
It's basically saying that you've got irreconcilable positions, right? They can't really coexist in the same society.
Right.
One will push the other out. The question is, which is it going to be?
Yeah, I would put it this way. Yeah, they're always even within unless you're libertarian, right? There are always some limits on free speech, right? The question is, where do you draw them, right? It was an interesting discussion in that congressional hearing is saying Palestine from the river to the sea, is saying intifada, right, forever. Is that genocidal? Is it hate speech? See, we got this new category called hate speech, right, that came in about 15 years ago, right?
And that was a product of the left.
That was a product of the left, right? And it was very clever and well done. By which they could exclude certain speech, right? and still say they're for free speech, right? I'm for free
Mhm.
speech, not for hate speech, right?
Mhm.
Kind of thing, right? Now, our response to that, and to some degree, rightly so, up to a point, was, well, hate speech is silly, or hate speech is just a way of getting around free speech, or blah, 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 right? And I think those arguments are kind of correct-ish, but, and it kind of, the way this congressional hearing went was like, well, what, is this language hate speech that you're protecting, or is it not, right? And it's kind of got them kind of knotted up in a way. And so that was, I think, to some degree effective. But instead, why don't we just say, like, we're for free speech as long as it's true?
Mm-hmm.
You could say that.
I'm for free speech as long as it's not subversive.
Yeah, I mean, those
or
terms are going to
un-American.
be fought over, though. True and
Yeah, so
subversive.
people would accuse you
Good.
of McCarthyism.
It
That's
is a better
fine.
conversation to have, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, in a
I'd
sense,
rather
I'm
have
kind of
that
like,
conversation.
that's what they're doing too. So
Yeah.
let's stop playing the
Well,
free
right,
speech
that's true.
game.
It is what they're
Let's
doing.
play the true false game.
Yeah.
We're right and you're wrong, and that's why
We're going to get to a fundamental point of philosophical departure we have from them, where we, like the trans discussion we were having earlier, where
sure
we measure the real from the body soul composite, and they measure the real in a very different way, right?
right.
That's good, though. I mean, to force that conversation would be good. I don't know that they are competent to have that conversation with us.
Perhaps.
And so I do wonder how you proceed just through dialogue with that.
Well, I
I don't
think
know what
Dr.
you
Smith
do.
is saying is you don't.
I think,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
win. And
Right.
and so one thing that I've been really interested in is, I got a little phrase for this, is red schools for red states. There is no reason our educational system in red states should be leftist.
Yeah.
The educational system in Tennessee should be straight right. I mean, we control all the counties. We control most of the mayor positions. We control the state legislature by super majorities that are ridiculous, right? We could take the Tennessee Board of Regents and design curriculum that all cuts right. We could do the same thing. I mean, we could go in that direction, and then we could have interesting debates between Thomas and Scotus. Right? There we could have the liberty of the schools, right? I mean, kind of like the Catholic Church.
So the
right?
thing is, Ben, what you're saying, of course, sounds really terrifying to a lot of people, right?
Yep.
It sounds like fascism.
Yep.
Right, authoritarianism. What I find interesting about it, though, is that if you actually look at the logic of your proposal, you're only proposing that the exact same thing that's being done now is done by different people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it seems like to me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like if I actually think, well, what has happened with higher education? What has happened with the major institutions, right? They have become completely dominated by leftist ideologues,
right?
And they use their power to secure and advance that position.
Sure. I mean, how did it turn out that so many American kids? This wasn't the case. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. Like in the 1980s and 90s when I was growing up, the kids didn't hate America.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a little bit of that, but it was on the fringe. Like that was kind of weirdos and stuff. Like the vast majority of people were either indifferent, right, or they were kind of just naturally patriotic.
Yeah.
Well, definitely what I like about the proposal is it doesn't seem to be purely reactionary. And that's the way conservative politics seems to be, or seems to have developed for so long, right? It's the left proposes something new and wild, and the right says, no, please stop.
Right.
Just over and over again while the needle moves.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
But if you're suggesting something different, right? Like especially moving away. So conservatism is always looking backwards, right? But it seems to be a sort of brand of conservatism, if I can even call it that you're pushing here. That's not just saying, let's rebuild the old republic. Right? Maybe long term that is what would happen, but the means to there is not backwards but forwards. Right? There's something different that needs to be done.
Sure.
So you want to wield the power of the political systems that are in place to achieve your end without everyone on your side. That's what I'm hearing. That seems sort of fair.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think that's what the statesman ought to do under these circumstances, right? I mean, at the end of the day, any civitas has to be judged by the bonum commune, and we aren't there.
Take the sort of mantra that a president often says, something like, "I'm the I was elected by one party, but I'm here to represent everyone." You're saying no. Right.
Right. I mean, I think that's kind of, I mean, the Biden, you remember when Biden got up there and had that creepy background? It was kind of like black and red.
The dark brown.
That's right. And he's kind of like this anti-MAGA thing. And I'm like, I don't want to come across that strongly. And I think if you were a smart politician, your rhetoric would be rightly keyed. Right.
Right.
But the truth is, right, that you are for, I mean, I might say something like the common good of the nation. Right. And
because people who know what you mean.
That's right. Right. People like us, right? But but that's the, I think that's kind of where you are, it's too bad that it's gotten to that point. But I think that just kind of, I mean, Aristotle and Plato teach us, right, that regimes change, history moves on, peoples change. No polis last forever, under its current regime. I think it's interesting, right, that they spend so much time talking about the change of regimes, right? They recognize it's a thing that happens, and so maybe we were a republic and maybe we won't be a republic anymore. Maybe we'll have to be an aristocracy or something like that, rightly understood.
So I guess the political philosophy question really at this point is what kind of polis can a given society actually have, right? So what, in other words, you can't just have any polis in any society. That was sort of that neocon experiment of
right. You're right about that. Yeah,
representative democracy, right?
Yeah,
every country on the planet.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't think like Catholic monarchy is as a candidate, for us. That'd probably be a whole fun discussion about for another episode. But it'd have to be something that, kind of analogous maybe to what we have, but also significantly different. I think at some point going forward, at least in terms of the way we need to think about those issues, I think, and the way we want to frame them, I think we have to start thinking about power as an instrument for achieving the good, not just the evil.
Yeah. One of the fun things about teaching Plato and Aristotle is how, especially Plato, people are so, by my students at least, they very quickly became anti-democratic, sort of elitists. They talk about bronze souls and stuff like that. So there's, I think, certainly people out there are amenable, and they can see, I think, problems with liberal culture.
I think you can see it now more than ever. Right.
Yeah.
I think actually in an odd sort of way, people are more open to recognizing the limitations of our current arrangements.
But this is sort of what you're proposing, right? Is sort of out of bounds in the same way that prior to Trump, a lot of conversation was out of bounds. Not that people weren't talking about it in communities like this, right? There's always been people against the sort of things that Trump was against. But Trump, in his bombastic and explosive way, sort of opened up the discussion for more moderate discourse about it. You almost need somebody like that who's just loud and angry and probably has a stronger position on it than you do, so that when you come into the scene, you seem like a nice, moderate, rational,
moderating force.
And I think what you're saying will be helpful in some communities, but I'm not even sure that the right in its present condition is ready for that, right? Democracy is still a really strong word in conservatism.
Yeah, you're right. I think that there is a right out there that's kind of your age and a little older and a little younger, that's more open to this than there was, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, for sure. But you're right. I think it takes some time. I mean, I think there's a strong, like, what some people call, sort of boomer conservatism, right? I mean, that has to go, under this auspice. We can just kind of salute it in respect, sort of.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for your service. This was wonderful. Maybe well remembered, that kind of thing.
Can't wait to study about you in history.
That's right. But we're turning the page. Well, I don't want to monopolize, but those are some, kind of thoughts that there is one other thing about this, Joe, is there are journals like Compact, which have big time writers on it who can describe themselves as post-liberal. So I think that language is kind of beginning to be out there, even in some places that are a little bit unusual.
Okay.
So our last, I think, point here, sort of heading here. I know we've gone long, but I think it's worth it. A little bit of, all of this, of course, is connected to, and in some way blows back into the life of the church. Obviously our faith guides us in thinking about these things a lot. We can talk about them philosophically, as we have a lot today, but there's obviously talk about them theologically. What are your thoughts, sort of, Rich, I guess in the last year and a half, on developments within, I guess, both within the church, but also in the church's relationship to the modern world?
Yeah. Well, it sure has been an interesting ride.
Right. Yeah. For sure.
So let me just cut to the chase on it. My diagnosis. Okay. So the past year, maybe the past several years, but I would say the past year in particular has been driven in the Catholic Church largely by the German synodal way, right? But that particular project and concerns from Rome that they would simply just do what they wanted to do, and what they want to do is obviously schismatic. I mean, it's obviously heretical. As a group. There are individual bishops there who are different, right? But but as a group, the German synodal way is just heresy. And and so there's back and forth between Rome and the German Bishops' Conference, the synodal way, telling them to rein in and so forth. Well, then at the end of the year, we get the decree from the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith about the possibility of providing blessings for couples in irregular sexual unions, including same-sex couples. And the language there is kind of ambiguous and leads to an instant amount of controversy, right? So the prevailing theory about what motivates it is, and I know there are people with all kinds of different views on this, right? There are those who are going to say that it's just, the German synodal way in the official church. But one, I think the prevailing interpretation is that the idea is to try to keep the Germans in the fold, to give them just enough to not go into schism.
Gotcha.
And so to find some language in which you could give them a yes on something, but really a no doctrinally, dogmatically on everything they actually want. Now, if you're paying attention to the Germans, you know that they're not going to be satisfied with that. They're smarter than that. And it's not what they want. So the decree immediately lights a fire in the church. The Germans aren't satisfied. And now the the JP2 B16 types, right? And I would put myself in that camp, are recoiling against the ambiguity in the language and what it says about the relationship between divine acts like blessings and immoral behaviors, right?
Right.
And so literature just immediately appears all over the Catholic press, right, in response to this. And meanwhile, in spite of the statements throughout the document that do, I will defend it in this way, say you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't, this is the doctrine of the church. Nonetheless, photograph of James Martin blessing a same-sex couple holding hands, right? I mean, it's just all over the place, immediate abuse. Well, the declaration said there wouldn't be any further clarification, but then within a couple of weeks of its life, a clarification, right? And the clarification, again, has to double down on the church's constant teaching and tradition regarding sexuality, and the moral law that surrounds it. So I would say that if you were on the left of these things, to use that language, all right, you probably were cheering when that declaration came down, but 2 weeks in, you probably now are coming to realize that that declaration was a disaster for you, because it really, I think it really put in stark relief what the issues actually are.
Okay.
And where the teaching of the church just has to be and can't deviate from.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So I think actually it turns out the declaration is a victory for the right.
When you see,
I know that's a strange position to maintain, but I'm saying sociologically.
When you see these this development, right? It does seem as if, right, the church is, and to some degree, I mean, this is what the church should do, right? The church is engaged with the world, right? The church isn't in itself, a Carthusian monastery. We love Carthusian monasteries, right? But that's not the whole of the church, right?
Right. It's one dimension of the church.
Yeah. And so, it should be engaged with the world, right? It should be interactive with it, right? And obviously this issue, right? I mean, you could even say this is kind of almost passe. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I do kind of reflect in sympathy with your remarks, Rich. I mean, you're talking about maybe a blessing, right? I mean, that's kind of behind the curve as far as the rest of the world is concerned, right? The rest of the world's already moved on to like transsexual. I mean, like, like this is way behind the times, but nevertheless, I mean, it definitely is an involvement with the zeitgeist. I guess there's a better and worse way to be engaged, though, right? With the zeitgeist, and I guess it depends on what time you think it is, right? In terms of the zeitgeist, like what's the weight of it, right? I mean, obviously, there's always going to be light and shadow until the Lord returns, right? There's going to be light and shadows in culture and time, right? It's always the case, right? How you engage with it, I guess, though, to some degree depends on your relative optimism, pessimism, evaluation.
Yeah. Right? And I think the church has been hit or miss in terms of its accuracy in telling time, culturally, right? Like what position it's going to maintain vis-a-vis the culture.
Right.
I think its history is one of hit and miss, right? Sometimes it takes exactly the right stance at the right time, and sometimes it just doesn't. One of the major criticisms that came from people like Ratzinger and Wojtyła, leading up to the Second Vatican Council, was that the anti-modernist movement in the church had just gone on too long, and that the world was just leaving the church behind completely. We were unable to influence the world because nothing we said was even in the conversation they were having anymore. And I think there's some accuracy to that.
Mhm.
I think that's not a completely incorrect position. Um, the Now today, right? I think that we also don't fully understand where we are, and I
Mhm.
think that even at the time of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes was maybe a bit Pollyannish in the way that it engaged the modern world, right?
Mhm.
Like we all really want good things for everyone. There's this general presupposition
We
that
all want justice.
we agree on the common good,
Yeah.
and that just isn't true.
Is that true? Yeah.
It's
We don't
not
mean the
true,
same thing.
right?
Yeah.
So the failure to recognize that, I think, led to a lot of problems for the church in the time following the Second Vatican Council. I'm not an anti-Vatican II guy, you know that,
Sure.
right? I'm a JP2 B16 kind of guy, and um, I like Gaudium et Spes well enough, but I do recognize, as Ratzinger did,
Mhm.
that it's not a flawless document, and that that it was a little naive in some ways.
Mhm.
I want to ask about the anti-modernism thing. Um, I I guess I see the problem if we're just if we let the world leave us behind. It seems like we'll just be some strange relic on the side. But what you also notice, at least I think it maybe especially in my generation, is that there's a number of folks that see the really old things in the church as particularly interesting. And as far as the modern zeitgeist sense of religion,
Mhm.
right? There's this strange movement back to the oldest pagan sorts of things people can find,
Uh-huh.
which are in no way right
Yeah.
modern or contemporary.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm conflicted. I guess my tendency is to just say, well, let the world sail right off the edge of the world. Maybe they'll hit rock bottom, and then we'll still be
Yeah.
here, so they
Well,
can come
again, there
back.
might be
Give them a safe harbor when they
yeah,
need it.
there might be a time for that. And for all I know, we're in that time right now. I'm not really sure. But no, when I say that the time for the anti-modernist movement had passed and that the world was leaving us behind, what I'm saying is that really the whole dialogue had become something completely different. We weren't even in modernism anymore. We were already in postmodernism
Mm-hmm.
by
Sure.
the time we abandoned the anti-modernism. Like, who are you even talking to anymore, right? We're reacting against things nobody's even doing. Okay. But postmodernism,
Mhm.
well, that by then was a thing. And we had nothing to say to it. We weren't even anticipating the terms of that debate. But people like Ratzinger and Wojtyła were, but the official position of the church hadn't caught up yet. Now, unfortunately, Gaudium et Spes and its Pollyannish position, right, with respect to the world, I think is what ultimately set most of the terms for the church's engagement with the world, rather than a more sophisticated
Mhm.
philosophical, like a recognition of the philosophical state of affairs, which
Sure.
is what we find in Ratzinger and Wojtyła and
Mhm.
others as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. You do find John Paul II later on in his pontificate um, expressing disappointment and surprise um, that he didn't recognize, and I think he meant, sort of him and his colleagues.
Uh-huh.
Um, he did recognize the degree to which totalitarian communism was opposed and evil,
Mm-hmm.
but didn't recognize how difficult or how inimical, so I should say, how inimical Western consumerism was to the spiritual life of Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
He recognized that later, it seems, but maybe not as much on the at the time. Now, I mean, and you can be forgiven for making a mistake.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Soviet Union is a whole different deal. than Western consumerism, which can be evil, but is evil in ways that are more or less obvious to see, right? I mean, you're not you're not talking about gulags and Stalin and things like that, right? As much.
And the differences in anthropology that were at work in contemporary Western society that, in comparison to what the church actually affirms, they're just really not compatible. So, anyway, all that stuff really got kind of glossed over after the Second Vatican Council. And I think that's what put the church in a position to let the world walk all over us and now sort of become a clay that the world shapes in its own image. But the church is still the church, and it's got a kind of substructure that ultimately the world won't be able to reshape. And I think that we're maybe reaching a point at which we're coming up against, as you sort of press your hands into that clay and try to work the church up into the image you want it to be. We're coming to that point where the resistance is too strong. It's just, you're not going to be able to go any further than that.
That's interesting.
Maybe, I mean, that's my hopeful read. And that from this moment of crisis, the church will kind of set out new shoots. There'll be new growth.
Yeah, good. Well, that's a welcome note of optimism and hope there to end on. Rich, I appreciate that.
I have my moments.
That's great. Well, guys, I really appreciate you joining in on the conversation, and I hope that our listeners and viewers benefited from what we had to say. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to like our video, share it with others. Go over and check out our website at catholicstudies.com. Find a lot of other great content there. Again, thanks so much for listening. Guys, thanks for participating. Until next time, God bless.